If someone had told me 10 years ago, when I first met Josh in college, that his quiet, formidable father would one day become the axis my entire world tilted on, I would have laughed. Not a real laugh, but that tight, anxious sound I make when confronted with an absurdity too vast to comprehend. Back then, Marcus was just a presence, a backdrop, the man who would show up on moving day, lift a sofa by himself without saying a word, and then retreat into the quiet corners of the house, smelling faintly of sawdust and coffee. He was a man carved from some harder, older material than the rest of us. He occupied space with a kind of gravitational pull, his silence more potent than other people's conversations. I, on the other hand, was a creature of quiet rooms and carefully curated solitude. My life was a fortress built of books and routine, its walls designed to keep the unpredictable world at bay. Josh was my bridge to that world, my one essential exception. And Marcus was simply his father, a fixed point in a distant constellation. I observed him the way an astronomer observes a remote planet, aware of its mass and its orbit, but with no expectation of ever setting foot on its soil. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, with hands that looked like they could fix anything or break anything with equal ease. His face was a landscape of quiet stoicism, mapped with lines that spoke of long hours in the sun and a life lived with more action than words. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it was a small, contained event, a brief flicker of warmth that never quite reached his eyes. Those eyes. They were a deep, serious gray, the color of a lake just before a storm. They saw everything and revealed nothing. Next to him, I always felt like a poorly sketched draft of a man, too thin, too pale, too lost in my own head. He moved with a certainty I could only dream of. I moved through life, hoping not to bump into the furniture. Our interactions were a collection of stilted pleasantries, exchanged over a decade of holiday dinners and birthday parties. Good to see you, Leo. You too, Mr. Cole. A nod, a handshake that was always too firm, his calloused palm engulfing my own, a brief, shocking point of contact with that solid, unreadable world he inhabited. Then he would turn away, his duty done, and the space between us would rush back in, cold and immense. The barrier wasn't just his reserved nature. It was the unspoken hierarchy of our connection. He was the father. I was the friend. A satellite in his son's orbit, nothing more. I had built a whole narrative around his silence, assuming it was a quiet judgment of my life, my choices, my very nature. He was a man who built things with his hands. I was a man who arranged words on a screen for a living. We were different languages, different species. And then Josh decided to get married. The wedding was to be in Oregon, 1,000 miles away. He and his fiancée had bought a small house there, and the week before, the ceremony was a frantic scramble of moving the last, most sentimental pieces of his childhood from his father's home. That was the disruption. The external event, arriving like a summons I could not ignore. Leo, I need a massive favor, Josh had said over the phone, his voice buzzing with that pre-wedding energy that is equal parts joy and panic. I had braced myself for a request to proofread his vows or design a seating chart. My dad's driving the old truck out with the last of my stuff. The dresser, Grandma's rocking chair, all that. It's a 3-day drive, and I really don't want him doing it alone. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I can't get away from work, and Sarah's swamped, he continued, oblivious to the sudden cessation of my breathing. Could you ride with him? Keep him company? Make sure he doesn't just drive straight through for 30 hours fueled by gas station coffee and sheer stubbornness? 72 hours. In the enclosed cab of a truck, with Marcus Cole. The idea was so terrifyingly absurd, it felt like a prank. My carefully constructed fortress was about to be invaded by the one person whose silence I found most unnerving. But it was for Josh, my one essential exception. Of course, I heard myself say, the words tasting like ash and surrender. I'd be happy to. The morning of our departure was gray and damp. The old Ford truck, a beast of faded blue metal and quiet power, idled in the driveway, its engine a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in my bones. Marcus was already there, securing a final tarp over the furniture in the truck bed. He moved with that familiar, unhurried competence, his hands knowing exactly how much tension to put on the rope, his body a study in practical grace. He wore a flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and dusted with fine, dark hair. He didn't see me approach. For a moment, I just watched him. I watched the concentration in his face, the slight furrow of his brow. I saw the weariness in the set of his shoulders, a subtle slump that wasn't there a few years ago. His wife had been gone for 5 years, and sometimes, in unguarded moments like this, you could see the shape of her absence still pressed against him. He finally turned, his gray eyes finding mine. No surprise, just a quiet, neutral acknowledgement. Leo. Morning, Marcus, I said, my voice feeling thin in the cool air. I'd decided to drop the Mr. Cole. It felt ridiculous given the circumstances. He didn't seem to notice. Coffee's on the counter if you want some, he said, turning back to his work. Got everything? I held up my duffel bag. This is it. He gave a short nod. Toss it in the back. We'll be on the road in 5. The cab of the truck was a small, self-contained world. It smelled of vinyl, old coffee, and that faint, clean scent of sawdust that clung to him. The space between the 2 bucket seats felt both vast and suffocatingly small. For the first hour, we drove in a silence so complete it felt like a third passenger. I stared out the window, watching the familiar suburbs dissolve into the long, monotonous green of the highway. My mind raced, a frantic hamster on a wheel, trying to think of something, anything, to say that wouldn't sound stupid or trivial. Nice weather. Truck runs well. So, how about that local sports team? Everything felt inadequate. My anxiety was a humming, high-frequency sound just beneath my skin. He, on the other hand, seemed perfectly at ease. His large hands rested on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He was a man comfortable with silence. I was a man who filled silence with internal screaming. It was another 2 hours before he spoke. There's a thermos on the floor, he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound that startled me. Pour me a cup, would you? I fumbled for the thermos, my hands suddenly clumsy. I unscrewed the cap and poured the steaming black coffee into a plastic cup, the smell filling the cab. The truck hit a small bump, and a little bit of the hot liquid sloshed over my fingers. I hissed, jerking my hand back. You okay? His eyes flicked from the road to me and back again, a flicker so fast I almost missed it. Yeah, fine, I mumbled, my face hot with embarrassment. I held the cup out to him. And that's when it happened. The first touch. As he reached for the cup, his fingers brushed against mine. It wasn't a brief, incidental graze. His hand was so much larger than mine, and for a split second, the rough, calloused pads of his fingers pressed against the back of my hand, against my knuckles. A jolt went through me. Not a spark. A full-blown electrical current. A shock of heat that shot up my arm and detonated somewhere in my chest. My heart, that frantic, trapped bird, beat a panicked rhythm against my ribs. He took the cup, his expression unchanged. He probably hadn't even noticed. It was nothing. It was less than nothing. But my hand was tingling, branded. I curled my fingers into a fist, hiding the evidence, and turned back to the window, my reflection showing a man with wide, startled eyes. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer empty. It was charged, full of the echo of that tiny, insignificant contact. I spent the next 100 miles replaying it in my head. The texture of his skin, the surprising warmth, the solid, undeniable reality of him. It was pathetic, I knew. I was a grown man, and a simple touch had sent me into a tailspin. But it had breached the walls, a tiny hairline crack in my fortress, and the outside world was starting to seep in. We stopped for lunch at a roadside diner. Watching him across the table was a new experience. I wasn't just observing a distant planet anymore. I was close enough to see the topography. I noticed a small white scar that cut through his left eyebrow. I noticed the way he held his fork, not delicately, but with a firm, practical grip, the same way he held a hammer or a steering wheel. I saw the faint lines of fatigue fanning out from the corners of his eyes, deeper than I'd ever realized. He looked tired, not just road-weary, but a deeper, more fundamental exhaustion that seemed to settle in his bones. He caught me staring. "Something on my face?" he asked, his tone flat. My face flushed again. "No, sorry, just thinking." He grunted, turning his attention back to his burger. But for a second, I thought I saw something else in his eyes. Not suspicion, not annoyance, curiosity. The second day on the road, somewhere in the vast empty plains of Wyoming, the truck started to make a sound. A high, rhythmic squealing that grew steadily louder. Marcus pulled over to the shoulder, the rumble of the engine dying into an ominous silence. He got out, opened the hood, and stared into the mechanical guts of the machine. I got out and stood beside him, feeling utterly useless. He tinkered for a while, his hands moving with practiced confidence, but the frown on his face only deepened. "Damn it," he finally muttered, wiping a streak of grease from his forehead with the back of his hand. Alternators shot. For the first time since I'd known him, Marcus Cole looked defeated. He stood there, staring at the dead engine, a man whose primary tool, his competence, had just failed him. He looked lost. And in that moment, the entire dynamic between us shifted. The gravitational pull reversed. "Okay," I said, and the single word sounded surprisingly steady in the quiet air. He looked at me, his gray eyes clouded with frustration. I pulled out my phone. "Let me see where we are." My world of screens and data, a world I was sure he disdained, suddenly became our only lifeline. I found our location on a map. I found a tow service in a small town 20 miles back. I found a single motel in that town, with a room available. I made the calls, my voice calm and efficient. Marcus just watched me, his silence no longer intimidating, but something else. It felt like astonishment. He, the man of action, was stranded, and I, the man of words, was suddenly in charge. The tow truck dropped us, and the wounded Ford at a dusty garage that smelled of oil and burnt rubber. The mechanic, a wiry old man, with a greasy cap, promised he could have the part by morning. We were stuck. We walked the half-mile to the motel, carrying our bags under a sky that was turning a bruised purple. The motel room was a study in beige and brown. 2 double beds, a single window looking out onto the parking lot, and the lingering scent of stale cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner. The air was thick with a new kind of tension, awkwardness. We were 2 men, forced into an intimacy neither of us had chosen. Marcus dropped his bag by one bed and sat on the edge, running a hand over his face. The strong, silent facade had crumbled, leaving behind a man who just looked tired and vulnerable. "Thanks, Leo," he said, his voice quiet. He didn't look at me. He looked at the worn-out carpet. Back there. I'm not good with that stuff. It's okay, I said, my own voice softer than I intended. I am. He finally looked up and his eyes held a strange, unguarded expression. It was like seeing the sun come out from behind a cloud for the first time. A brief, startling moment of clarity. He was seeing me. Really? Seeing me. Not as Josh's friend. Not as the pale, bookish kid who hung around his house. But as the person who had just navigated him out of a crisis. We ordered a pizza from the only place in town that delivered. We sat on our respective beds, eating slices from the cardboard box balanced between us. A storm had rolled in, and the rain began to beat against the window, a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The dim light from the bedside lamp cast long shadows across the room, creating a small, isolated world for just the two of us. The conversation started slowly, haltingly. He asked about my work. Not the polite, dismissive questions I was used to, but real questions. He wanted to know what I wrote about, how I found the words, if it ever got lonely. It does, I admitted, the confession feeling heavy and true in the small room. Most of the time. He nodded slowly, his gaze distant. I know what that's like, he said, and the words were so quiet I almost didn't hear them over the rain. He started talking about his wife, Sarah. He didn't talk about her death, but about her life, about the way she used to laugh, the way she could make anything grow in her garden. He spoke of the silence in the house after she was gone, a silence so loud it felt like a constant scream. Josh leaving, it's the right thing, he said, staring at the pizza box. He's happy. But the house is going to be, it's going to be too quiet. My heart ached for him, for this strong, capable man who was admitting, in his own gruff way, that he was profoundly lonely, that he was afraid of the silence to come. I always thought you didn't like me very much, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. My face burned. I wanted to snatch them back out of the air. He looked up, and his expression was one of genuine surprise. Why would you think that? I don't know, I mumbled, picking at a loose thread on the bedspread. We're just, different. You're always so quiet around me. I figured you disapproved. He was silent for a long moment. The rain drummed against the glass. I'm quiet around everyone, Leo, he said finally, his voice low and serious. That's just me. He paused, and then added something that made the air crackle. And I wasn't quiet because I disapproved. I was quiet because I didn't know what to say to you. You're different. You see things. Always watching. Made me feel like I was made of glass. My breath caught in my throat. He had seen me watching him. All those years I thought I was invisible, a ghost in the corners of his life. But he had seen me, and he had been just as intimidated by me as I was by him. The space between the beds seemed to shrink, the air growing thick and warm. I could feel the heat of his body across the small gap. I could smell the faint scent of rain and soap and something that was uniquely him. My own loneliness, a thing I had worn like a second skin for years, felt suddenly unbearably sharp. It was a hunger, and for the first time, I felt it mirrored in the man sitting across from me. We had finished the pizza. The box sat between us like a monument to a conversation that had changed everything. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was happening. So I just sat there, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for a lightning strike. He was the one who moved first. He stood up, not abruptly, but with a slow, deliberate motion. He took the empty pizza box and placed it carefully by the door. Then he turned back to me. He didn't return to his bed. He stood in the small space between them, looking down at me. The lamplight caught the silver at his temples and carved his face into angles of light and shadow. He looked magnificent and terrifying. "Leo," he said, and my name was a question. I couldn't speak. I could only look up at him, my entire being a raw, exposed nerve. He took one step, then another. He sat down on the edge of my bed. The mattress dipped with his weight, and I slid an inch closer to him. He was so close now, I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He lifted a hand, his large, calloused, capable hand, and hesitated for a fraction of a second before gently touching my face. His thumb stroked along my jawline, the touch both rough and incredibly tender. It was a question. Everything in me screamed, "Yes." I leaned into his touch, a small, involuntary movement, closing my eyes. A shudder went through his hand, or maybe it was me who trembled. I didn't know. He leaned in, slow, so slow, giving me every opportunity to pull away. I didn't. I couldn't. I met him halfway, and then his lips were on mine. It wasn't a frantic, passionate kiss. It was hesitant. It was questioning. It was the most honest thing I had ever felt. His lips were firm and dry, and he tasted faintly of coffee and rain. It was a kiss of profound, shattering loneliness finding its equal. A collision of two solitudes in a cheap motel room in the middle of nowhere, with the storm raging outside and a universe of quiet collapsing between us. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine. His gray eyes, inches from my own, were dark with an emotion I couldn't name. "Leo," he whispered again, and this time it wasn't a question. It was a statement, an acknowledgement, a beginning. I woke to the gray pre-dawn light filtering through the thin motel curtains. For a blissful, disoriented moment, I didn't know where I was. I only knew that I was warm, wrapped in the heavy scent of another person, my head resting on a solid breathing chest. Then memory crashed down on me like a tidal wave. Marcus, my best friend's father. My stomach twisted into a knot of pure, cold dread. I lifted my head carefully. He was still asleep, his face relaxed in a way I had never seen it before. The harsh lines were softened, his mouth slightly parted. He looked younger. He looked peaceful, and I was filled with a sudden, overwhelming urge to flee. What had we done? Panic, cold and sharp, clawed its way up my throat. This was a mistake, a catastrophic, life-altering mistake. He would wake up and regret would be the first thing in his eyes. Regret and disgust. I had taken advantage of his grief, his loneliness. I had ruined everything. I had broken some sacred, unwritten rule. My carefully constructed life, my one essential friendship with Josh. It was all about to come crashing down. I slid out of the bed as quietly as I could, my movements stiff and clumsy. I gathered my clothes from the floor, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip my jeans. I didn't look at him. I couldn't bear to see him wake up. I retreated to the bathroom, closing the door without a sound, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The man looking back was a stranger, his eyes wide with terror, his skin flushed. He looked like a criminal. When I finally emerged, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, Marcus was awake. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to me, pulling on his boots. The silence in the room was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure. All the warmth, all the fragile intimacy of the night before had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, sterile vacuum. He didn't turn around. He didn't speak. "The garage opens at 8, I said, my voice a strained whisper. I'll go get some coffee." He just nodded, his shoulders tense. He wouldn't look at me. And that was it. That was all the confirmation I needed. The rest of the drive was a special kind of hell. The truck was fixed by noon, and we were back on the road. The easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a tense, painful awkwardness that was 1,000 times worse than our initial silence. The cab of the truck felt like a cage. Every mile was an agony. I replayed every moment of the night before, dissecting it, searching for the exact moment I had made my fatal error. My internal world was a catastrophe of self-recrimination and shame. He drove, his eyes fixed on the road, his jaw tight. The man beside me was once again the stranger I had known for 10 years. Distant, unreadable, formidable. When we finally reached Oregon, he pulled up to the hotel where I was staying. He cut the engine, and the silence rushed in, vast and final. "Well?" he said, still not looking at me. "Here you are." My heart felt like a stone in my chest. This was it, the dismissal. "Thanks for the ride," I said, the words tasting like poison. I grabbed my bag, my hand fumbling for the door handle. "See you at the rehearsal dinner," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. And then I was out of the truck, standing on the pavement, watching as the faded blue Ford pulled away and disappeared into traffic. My former solitude, the comfortable quiet of my old life, had returned. But it was different now. It was tainted by the shape of his absence. It was no longer a fortress. It was a ruin. The next 24 hours were a blur of forced smiles and hollow conversations. I helped Josh and Sarah with last-minute wedding preparations, moving boxes and arranging flowers, my body on autopilot while my mind was stuck in that motel room. I felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of their happiness. The rehearsal dinner was held in the backyard of a rustic restaurant. Strings of fairy lights were draped between the trees, casting a warm, magical glow over everything. It was beautiful. And I felt nothing. I saw him across the lawn, talking to one of Sarah's uncles. He looked impossibly handsome in a dark button-down shirt, his shoulders seeming even broader than I remembered. Our eyes met for a fleeting second, and he looked away, his expression unreadable. My stomach plummeted. I spent the next hour actively avoiding him, keeping a buffer of laughing, happy people between us at all times. I nursed a glass of wine, hiding in a shadowed corner, feeling the familiar walls of my fortress rebuilding themselves around me, brick by painful brick. It was better this way. Pretend it never happened. Go back to being Josh's friend and nothing more. It was the only way to survive. And then a hand closed around my arm. A large, warm, calloused hand. I knew the touch instantly. My heart stopped. "We need to talk," Marcus said, his voice low and urgent beside my ear. He didn't wait for an answer. He gently but firmly steered me away from the party, around the side of the restaurant, into the quiet darkness of a small, unlit garden. The sounds of the party faded, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the frantic beating of my own heart. He finally let go of my arm and stood in front of me, his tall frame silhouetted against the distant lights. He looked just as wrecked as I felt. The lines on his face were deeper in the shadows, his eyes dark pools of uncertainty. "Leo," he started, his voice rough. He stopped, swallowed, and started again. "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air between us. Sorry it happened? Sorry for me? "I'm not good at this," he said, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of pure frustration. "Any of this." He took a deep breath. The way I acted. After. In the truck. That wasn't right. "I'm sorry." I stared at him, unable to form a response. "I haven't felt anything like that in a very long time," he continued, his gaze fixed on something over my shoulder. "Maybe ever." and it scared the hell out of me. His eyes finally met mine, and they were filled with a raw, startling vulnerability. "I didn't pull away because I regretted it," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I pulled away because I was afraid. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what you wanted." The breath I had been holding rushed out of me in a shaky exhale. It wasn't regret. It was fear. The same fear that had been gnawing at me, a mirror image of my own panic. "I was scared too," I confessed, my voice barely audible. "I thought I'd ruined everything." A small sad smile touched his lips. "The only thing you've ruined," he said, "is my ability to imagine my life without you in it. And it's only been 3 days." He took a step closer, closing the space between us. He didn't touch me. He just stood there, letting me see the truth in his eyes. The longing, the hope, the terror. It was all there. And it was beautiful. The wedding was a blur of white dresses and champagne toasts. I watched Josh at the altar, his face shining with a pure, uncomplicated happiness, and I felt a pang of something close to envy. Could it ever be that simple? During the reception, the music was loud and people were dancing. I was sitting at a table near the back, watching the celebration, feeling like I was on the outside looking in. Marcus appeared at my side, seemingly out of nowhere. He sat down in the empty chair beside me. He didn't say a word. He just reached under the table, his hand searching for mine. Our fingers interlaced. His grip was firm, warm, and possessive. It was a small, secret gesture, hidden from the world by a white linen tablecloth. A tangible act of commitment, an anchor in the swirling chaos of my emotions. He was choosing me, right here, in the middle of his son's wedding. And in that quiet, hidden touch, I chose him back. We didn't talk about the future. We didn't talk about Josh. We just sat there, holding hands under the table, while the world celebrated around us. It was enough. The story doesn't end there, of course. It begins. The weeks that followed were a careful navigation of a new, uncharted territory. There were difficult conversations, moments of doubt, and the constant, low-grade fear of discovery. But underneath it all was a current of certainty, a quiet, powerful force pulling us together. A few months later, I found myself standing in his kitchen on a Tuesday morning. Sunlight streamed through the window over the sink, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The room smelled of coffee and bacon. I was wearing one of his old t-shirts, which was ridiculously large on me, and a pair of my own sweatpants. Marcus was at the stove, his back to me, scrambling eggs. He was humming, a low, tuneless sound of pure contentment. The silence between us was no longer a weight or a weapon. It was a comfortable, shared space. A home. I came up behind him and wrapped my arms around his waist, resting my cheek against the warm, solid expanse of his back. He didn't startle. He just leaned back into me, his hand coming up to cover mine where they were clasped over his stomach. We stood like that for a long moment, just breathing together. The simple domesticity of it was more profound, more intimate than anything that had happened in that motel room. This was real. This was lasting. I used to think my life was a carefully plotted novel, a quiet, solitary story where I controlled every sentence. I lived in fear of the unpredictable, the messy, the emotionally risky. And then Marcus Cole showed up like an unexpected plot twist, tearing out the pages of my well-ordered life and rewriting the entire story. He was the disruption that saved me. He was the silence that finally taught me how to listen. He was the solid ground beneath my feet, a man who built things with his hands and who, against all odds, had decided to build a life with me. He turned from the stove, a plate of eggs in his hand, and that small, rare smile touched his lips. This time, it reached his eyes. And in the quiet light of that ordinary morning, I knew I had finally, impossibly, found my way home.